Hi, this video is going to be a topic analysis that covers the January-February topic that resolved states ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. So let's jump into some key terms for the topic. The first term that we should address is what does the word states mean in the topic. That is the actor of the resolution. And states means not just the United States. This is not a United States specific topic. States is generic. However, this leads us to a few different questions that I think are good to consider when we're first thinking about the topic, which is, does states mean all states ought to, eliminate their nuclear arsenals? Does states mean some states ought to ban their nuclear arsenals? Because if you think about it, states could refer to every single state, or it could just even refer to two. United States and Russia would be states. This means that there could be an affirmative that does any permutation of any two states that grammatically would meet the standard of states. So I think that there's going to be some theory debate for sure, but we'll get into that later. The second question, or the second key term that we ought to talk about is what does eliminate mean? And I think that most likely most people will defend that eliminate means you would be banning the use of these nuclear arsenals. However, I think that the way in which the ban occurs is something that could be up for debate and may vary from affirmative to affirmative. Finally, nuclear arsenals. This is pretty straightforward. Nuclear arsenals refer to nuclear weapons like that of which the United States used during World War II to bomb Hiroshima. Nuclear arsenals consist of atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs. That should be a pretty straightforward debate. So moving on, who has nuclear arsenals? So there are currently 27,000 nuclear weapons total, and 26,000 of those belong to the United States and Russia. So they're kind of the big players. However, other states also have nuclear weapons. There are the non-prolife treaty designated nuclear weapon states, which consist of China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States. Then there are some other states, including India, North Korea, and Pakistan. And then Israel probably has some nuclear weapons. So in total, there are 9 states, as well as some NATO member nuclear weapon sharing states, which include Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey. But again, we see that the United States and Russia have the majority of these weapons, which is important to note because I think that these two countries will be specifically important when we are addressing this debate. So I think that we should look a little bit at the effects of nuclear arsenals and the role that they've played historically. So in 1945, during World War II, nuclear arsenals were used to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They caused mass devastation, and we saw that hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. However, this does not mean that nuclear arsenals have not been used in non-war contexts. For example, states often test them in non-combatant situations, which means that we are able to see the effects not on a human scale, but we know that they can cause, aside from the mass devastation that they caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that they have the ability to do much, much more. We also see that states have lots of nuclear arsenals now for protection. This is partially because of the idea of mutually assured destruction, and this might be veering into affirmative arguments, but the idea of mutually assured destruction is that if everyone has nuclear weapons, then no one will use them because it will cause a nuclear war and everyone will die. So that's veering a little bit into affirmative argumentation, but I do think it's a good thing to have for background on the topic. This argues that it will allow for greater security because studies have shown that the state with more warheads was only 1/3 as likely to be challenged militarily by other countries and more than 10 times more likely to prevail in a crisis. So this kind of explains why states would choose to adopt the use of these nuclear weapons in the first place, because we see that they do provide for a lot of advantages security-wise, and given that all these major global players have these nuclear weapons, we can see why lots of countries are now vying to get their hands on them and why it is such a pertinent topic given the effects that they have. So now let's actually get into some arguments. Let's start with some affirmative arguments. I think that the most intuitive affirmative argument is that, we saw that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that that nuclear weapons just are immoral. They cause mass deaths and devastation, and we ought not have something that could cause this type of impact. You could make the argument that there are rising global tensions. This should be pretty easy to show why war between great powers is probable. And the most straightforward affirmative argument, in my opinion, is that we need to ban nuclear arsenals, nuclear weapons before this happens, so that we can avoid, having a mass war break out. I was just reading an article that said that, right now we are at the greatest probability that we've been in all of history for breaking out into nuclear war. I think that there should be pretty good uniqueness on this, because we see tensions are rising right now between the United States and North Korea currently. They just said that they were going to be sending us like a quote unquote gift for Christmas. Like, that is not a good situation. India and Pakistan are in disagreement. There's a United States-China trade war going on, etc. So I think that there could be a lot of scenarios, if you take on a util-based AF or even a structural violence AF, as to why we are on the brink of having something like this spiral out of control, and why it's important that we take action now to eliminate these arsenals. And I think that veering off of that, another good argument that the affirmative can make is this argument about miscalculation. Because even if there's a real concern that even if countries are not intending to cause nuclear war, miscalculation can occur. And we've seen in the past that there have been a lot of like near misses where we've almost fired nuclear weapons. I was reading an article that says, quote, erroneous or ambiguous warnings from US or Russian early warning sensors of an incoming nuclear attack are relatively common, which means that there is a highly probable chance that one country misinterprets a signal from another country, there's a mistake that's made, and then it spirals out of control. And given the mass devastation that these weapons can cause, it makes a lot of sense why we should get rid of them if it is possible to have these miscommunications as frequently as we are currently having them. Moving on, another affirmative argument that could be made is that it's important for us to ban nuclear weapons in order to avoid nuclear terrorism. Essentially, this argument is that, the more nuclear weapons that we have, the greater likelihood that one is able to fall into the hands of a terrorist organization and a terrorist group, which would obviously be bad because, then they themselves would obviously want to fire it and just kill civilians. And I think that there could be a good, link chain there. Further, we can argue that there would be economic benefits. For example, in the United States, according to the Brookings Institution, the United States spends $25 to $35 billion per year on nuclear weapons. So if you calculate how much that must have been since World War II, that's probably, trillions of dollars at least. So that money could probably be better spent if all states eliminate their nuclear arsenals, going towards programs to help the impoverished people in our society, and further could, potentially be used on a global scale to do something to benefit others. This is just an idea. And finally, I think that a pertinent affirmative argument could just be like a moral principle argument. This is very good to make, I think, if you're going to be going to a lay tournament, which is that there's no reason really that we need these weapons. There's nothing really good that it brings to us, and that it's important for states to eliminate their arsenals on principle, given that, our armies are sufficient, and that it's also a violation of international humanitarian law. I think this would be great to bring up in a lay case, that it violates the distinction, it violates proportionality, and it's also indiscriminate violence that causes mass death. And I think a lay judge would be particularly persuaded by these, arguments that are more grounded in the principles of the topic. So moving on to a few final AF arguments, we can just look a little bit at the impacts of what would occur if a nuclear war were to begin. I think that this is relatively straightforward, but I'll just run through it really quickly, because I actually think that when I was reading about it, I was surprised by the different, it's not just like, lots of people die when a nuclear bomb is dropped, but it can also lead to nuclear winter, radiation, refugee crises. Obviously, we saw the radiation in Hiroshima, but I just think that the impacts are much more widespread than we would think. Specifically, I was struck by this quote, which says that less than 1% of the nuclear weapons in the world today could cause a nuclear famine, with the potential to put 2 billion people at the risk of starvation. So it's not just a, it's not as though when you shoot someone, they're the only person that dies. Dropping a nuclear weapon has the potential to cause unimaginable consequences in terms of scope. So I thought that was important to point out. Another thing that the AF should consider is the implementation of what it means to eliminate nuclear arsenals. So currently there is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. One way to implement it could be that all countries ought to adopt this treaty. This could be an immediate abolition of nuclear weapons, meaning that we would destroy our existing nuclear weapons. We've seen that other countries have already signed on. I think that I read a quote that said that like 122, I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's something to research. And the wording of the resolution means that we can assume that these weapons no longer exist. So I think that this treaty could be a good way in which you could argue for the implementation of eliminating these nuclear arsenals. So moving on, let's take a look at some negative arguments. I think that this is a really good topic, obviously, for like util and LARPing, because it's about nuclear weapons, which nuclear war is that classic like util impact. So I think that this is going to be really, really well suited to people who like to debate in a more policy style fashion. I think that one really great disad to consider is the deterrence disad. I think that this Margaret Thatcher quote sums it up really well, which says that conventional weapons have never been enough to deter war, and that countries are more likely, as I touched on a bit earlier, given the principle of mutually assured destruction, to try not to escalate, because there's this fear of one country launching a nuclear weapon and it causing all-out nuclear war. And in this way, nuclear weapons serve as an important deterrent. It might seem a little counterintuitive, but if you think about it, if the only thing that's at risk, quote unquote, only thing that's at risk is going to war, which doesn't have the scope that nuclear weapons do, countries will probably be a lot more likely to escalate with each other and cause greater conflict. This is known as like the quote-unquote porcupine theory, which means that I guess that countries are just more careful with each other because they know that the consequences of nuclear war could be so devastating. And I think that this should be something that is easy to warrant, because it's definitely probable that there's going to be greater conflict once you get rid of nuclear weapons, given that it's such a volatile topic and a volatile situation, that I think that you will be able to find authors who argue this. In that same line, you can also argue that the ban won't solve the root issue of the conflict, and that we'll just turn to other forms of violence. Perhaps they won't be as great in scope as a nuclear weapon, but you could argue either, I don't know, maybe for probability, you could argue for the frequency. I think that there are a lot of interesting arguments that could be made there in terms of weighing. A second disad that we might want to look at is the verification disad, which is how do we verify that states really get rid of arsenals? And if we're not able to verify that, doesn't it just end up making the issue of nuclear weapons more insidious, more cloaked in secrecy? For example, Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency struggled to tell whether Iran was actually complying when I believe they were supposed to be putting limits or stopping their nuclear arsenal production. We've also seen that this has occurred in places like Syria, where we're not actually able to tell that they're complying with these international rules and regulations. So it does raise a question that I think is really important, which is how do we actually know that these countries are not just going to keep nuclear weapons, or that they're actually going to disarm? You should ask the affirmative in cross X if you're negating, how do you make sure that these countries actually get rid of the nuclear weapons, and not that, you have just North Korea with the weapons? That's probably a really bad situation to be in. Even if we could ensure that every single country got rid of it, there is the argument that it won't actually solve anything, because countries will just have, quote, hair trigger mobilization plans to rebuild weapons, and, quote, every crisis would become a nuclear crisis. Any war could become a nuclear war, meaning that countries will just not actually have the weapons, but they'll be ready to construct them very quickly. And I know that sounds like, how could you just construct a nuclear weapon? But this comes from the idea of dual use, which is that a lot of the infrastructure that is used for other other activities that would be still allowed can be repurposed very quickly to fashion a nuclear weapon. So I would consider taking a look at that argument, which I've put in a little link below. But basically, what this decide would be saying is that the AF has no solvency, there's less certainty as to what is going on with these nuclear weapons, and then it's more harmful because now it means that these weapons are cloaked in secrecy, they're quote unquote banned, but we don't know which countries actually have them, we don't know the state at which they have them, and that, you could just say like nuclear weapons are here, they're here to stay, and it would be worse if we just tried to put it back in the to put it back in the bag, like it's not going to happen, or to put it back in the box if you're thinking of it like Pandora's box. It's already out there, and now if we try to rein it back in, it's only going to become more insidious. So that's something to think of. Moving on to some negative arguments in relation to counterplans. There are a few counterplans that I think that you could consider. One could be reducing the number of nuclear arsenals but not banning them, because this would solve, I think, for both of the disads. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. Second, you could say, or I don't think that they conflict with the disads that they link. Second, you can say that we should phase out the nuclear arsenals rather than immediately banning them. This would be exclusive with the AF on time frame. You could argue for some picks. You can argue that you should just have US and Russia ban. I was reading an article on that. You could argue US, China, and Russia. You do have to make sure in cross-X to, if your opponent is reading a whole res af, to say you will defend every single state bans it, and make sure that they won't sever out of the affirmative advocacy. Make sure that they're defending a whole res af, but I think that picks would be a good idea on this topic. You can also argue that we should implement other treaties instead that don't outright ban these weapons, like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty or the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. And I've also linked another solvency advocate and another article that you can read down there. Some final negative arguments include some theory that I've been thinking about. I think that the neg will be able to read theory like you must defend all states if the affirmative only defends a few. You can argue you must defend more than one state. For example, if the affirmative got up and said, North Korea should eliminate their nuclear arsenals, because the topic is that states ought to do it. So you can say that semantically they don't meet it, and you can also make arguments about limits. You can also say that you must defend more than two states. In that case, even if the affirmative semantically, grammatically meets that multiple states ought to ban it, you can say that it's a generic plural first, which means that, or it's a bare plural, which means that it means all states ought to. But second, you can say that there are lots of different permutations of states that would be eliminating it. You can do the math on that, but you can say that it just still explodes limits. You could also read theory saying that you must specify the implementation of how states would eliminate it, because maybe that directs like how you would be reading disads, things like that. And finally, critiques. I'm not too sure what the critiques on this topic would be. I think that some things I've seen in the past is that people will read critiques about the rhetoric that we use describing other countries and in situations that have to do with national security, which I think is relevant on this topic. And then there's like a Baudrillard-esque critique about disaster porn, which is basically when the affirmative constructs really blown out impact scenarios, and it's critiques the practice of doing that. So that's my wrap up on this topic. I think it's a super interesting topic, and please reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks.